Okay, that's 1 minute past, and I think we will get going. So, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining. I think this is Bulletproof's fourth webinar we've run. So, if you're returning, thank you so much for coming back. We're clearly doing something right, and if you're first time, welcome. Today's webinar is all around NHS Data Security and Protection Toolkit. I am James. I sit in the sales team, but more importantly, I'm joined by Richard Bradley, who's our head of data protection and well placed to talk through everything toolkit. And it's a really dense and complicated topic. So bear with us, there's a lot to get through. I'm really excited to do that. But before I kick off, a quick introduction to Bulletproof, and I won't bore you, it'll take 30 seconds of your time. We're a cybersecurity provider. We've been trading for the best part of 10 years now. We like to think of ourselves, Bulletproof, as having three key pillars to what we do: cybersecurity, information security, and everything data protection. So do check out our website if you've never seen it before. But without further ado, we're going to dive into everything DSP Toolkit. Have your phones at the ready, everyone. We're going to have a bit of an interactive session at the beginning. There's a quick Slido that, if you're not familiar with Slido, you just have to scan a QR code, and it lets us almost get a bit of a gauge and understanding of where you're at with the toolkit. So we're going to dive in. Sam, next slide, please. And then we'll do a quick introduction to Richard as well. Next slide, please, Sam. Great. So this is your time. If you can, you see that barcode top left, you could just scan that. And there's a couple of options that should come up. So the question we're posing is, have you previously completed an NHS DSP Toolkit submission? So I'll wait just a couple of seconds. If you can scan that, it should be pretty quick. Yeah. Yes, we've submitted with no issues. No, this is our first year submitting. We thought that'd be the case for a lot of you. Yes, but we've struggled in the past. Okay, great. Great stuff. So it looks like we've got a real blend across the board here. Well, fear not. Hopefully we should be able to answer all these questions as we go and have something for everyone in this webinar. Next slide, please, Sam. How well do you understand the requirements of the NHS DSP Toolkit? Not very well. I find the requirements confusing. Not at all. I need a lot of guidance. Not very well. I find the requirements confusing. Very well, and I'm confident in my knowledge. Yeah, great, guys. Thanks so much. It really helps Richard tailor what he's going to say today. Fantastic. Hopefully you know you're in good company and everyone's in the same boat or thereabouts. Next slide, please, Sam. Final one for us. What is or will be your biggest challenge when completing the DSP Toolkit submission? So understanding the requirements, gathering necessary documentation, ensuring compliance with security standards, lack of internal resources, expertise, time constraints, or I imagine a lot of the above or all of the above. Yeah. A nice blend across the board, guys. So hopefully we should be able to answer all of this as we go. Yeah, great. Hopefully you know you're in good company here. Okay, Sam, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to quickly run through the webinar objectives. Naturally, we want to understand the NHS DSP Toolkit. Rich is going to take you through preparing strategies. And number 3, roles of professionals for support. You need the right team in place. I'm going to hand over to Richard now. Richard, a quick introduction to yourself. And then I suppose we're going to dive in.
Yes, thank you very much, James. And thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. So who am I and why should you listen to me? So Richard has introduced the head of the data protection team here at Bulletproof. I've been working in data protection for more years than I'm going to admit, but my hairline's probably giving the game away on that one at this point, and specifically on the DSP toolkit since before the current toolkit, when it was the IG toolkit way back before GDPR. I worked on the toolkit submission for probably about 2 or 3 dozen different organizations at this point, ranging from small community providers to large infrastructure providers, sort of everyone in between, pretty much. If it's okay, we're going to run through today quite a few bits of detail on the toolkit, what's required. We're going to try to keep it high level. If I do get bogged down in detail, James is going to give me a prod to keep moving because we've not got the greatest amount of time this afternoon. So if we're all ready, next slide, please.
As we're doing that, Richard, I don't want to interrupt. If you have any questions, and I should have mentioned this at the beginning, please put them in the chat, and I can ask Richard as we go, or I can leave them till the end for our Q&A session. Hopefully, we'll have a bit of time at the end for some questions, but please put your questions in as we go.
Cheers. Thank you very much, James. So if you're attending today, and as we've seen with the polls at the start today, about half of the people on this call already have an idea of what the toolkit is, but there are some of you out there that don't have much experience with it so far. Today's session is for both of you. It all goes back to the IG toolkit before GDPR, and it was overhauled in 2018 to reflect legal changes, and it's been kept up to date ever since. We'll go over the pitfalls and the specifics as we go through today's session, but in summary, it's a self-assessment questionnaire. There isn't someone actively marking your work as you go through it, but yes, sometimes people will check what you put in afterwards. It started as a means for the NHS providers to get their ducks in a row for compliance, and then it expanded into something that serves as a baseline for everyone operating within the sector. The number of questions and evidence items varies from around 40 to 130 for those completing the standard toolkit, and that number rises to over 200 indicators of good practice for those who need to complete the new cyber assessment framework aligned toolkit. And that one's pretty much reserved for NHS trusts and the like. The questions vary from a simple yes or no to more in-depth responses which require the upload or provision of links to evidence items. They actually need to provide what the documents are, etc. And the security considerations within it broadly align with Cyber Essentials Plus. That's considered sort of the basic benchmark for this process. As it says on screen, the requirements of the toolkit are normally considered the minimum standard for working in the sector in England. Over time, the number of organisations required to make this submission has expanded quite considerably. So, for example, an NHS trust has made a policy that anyone working for or on their behalf, when it comes to data, needs to have standards met for the toolkit. So their pathology provider needs standards met. They themselves, in turn, need to get their IT provider to do it, and their temporary staffing provider and audit provider, and you can see how this ripples all the way through anyone vaguely supplying the sector. Next slide, please.
Just while Richard had a little break there, Cyber Essentials, if you've never seen it or never heard of it, check out the Bulletproof website. Lots of really useful information on there on Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus.
Cheers. So why is it important? So why are we doing all this work? So I'll start first with that there are two different formats for it, which hopefully sort of shows you that they are tailoring it based on the risks and the complexity of different types of organizations. They're not trying to overburden people. The first follows the standard traditional format most of us who have worked on it before are familiar with the sort of 40 to 130 questions. And that's what most organizations who complete it will still be completing. And when I say most, the overwhelming vast majority will be completing that format. But from this year onwards, NHS trusts, foundation trusts, those providing acute mental health, community and ambulance, who are trusts, integrated care boards, commissioning support units and arm's length bodies all need to complete the new format, which is over 200 questions. It is completely different in its sort of layout and how you complete it and so on, and sort of has a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you respond to some of the requirements. Most of today's going to be focused on the former, but we will still touch on the latter. But just about every aspect of information governance and security is still considered in both. So more focusing on why it's important to you. If you want to work in, for, or with this sector, this is the benchmark for entry. If you don't achieve standards met or standards exceeded, or for social care providers approaching standards, you may be shut out of the sector, essentially. If you were working in the sector and then you had standards not met the next year, you may lose contracts. You may even have contracts terminated with penalty. So it could be a costly thing to happen. I don't want to be here just throwing bad news at people or scaring people, but it's important that people understand what the implications are for not giving it the weight and the priority it needs. The toolkit can be seen as a process by which the NHS as a whole can prove that trust in them is due. Past issues around records being incorrectly merged, confidentiality breaches, record destruction, and temporary loss of access to data have all resulted in the worst effects for individuals, including delayed treatment, withdrawal from services, worsened clinical outcomes, and I'm afraid I'm going to use the word even death. That has happened. So when you go through the questions in the toolkit for the first time and think about the incidents that have occurred, you can quickly build up a picture that the reason each of the questions exists is because something went badly wrong somewhere in the past. It's an opportunity to prioritize doing the right thing in the organization. We'd all love to get this stuff our full attention all the time, but if we're honest, we've got another job to do. This means that you need to get on top of the training, review your documentation at least annually. The benefit here is that you should have less that goes wrong as a result of doing this work. Some of the activities such as the information asset register can also help with things like planning for systems changes or process change. So you want to put a new platform in place for a new piece of software, you should already have the requirements and the data that needs to handle all documented, so you're saving that business analysis time. The other considerations here are when you're bidding for other work, so not just NHS work, the compliance packs you're asked to complete, the due diligence questionnaires, the answers for those are pretty much all here. And some would even take the standards met or standards exceeded rating as being essentially a way of demonstrating those answers, if I may say it that way around. Next slide, please. So who needs to complete it? I think we've touched on this already, so I'll try to be short with this one. But if you provide health or social care services in England, you handle health or social care data for those who do, or you have access to NHS systems or data, you're normally going to be required to complete the toolkit each year. So what do I mean by that? Obviously, if you're providing frontline public health services of one form or another, that obviously brings you into scope. But if you're an IT provider for a provider, or you're an audit provider, or you're an IT provider to an audit provider, you can sort of see how that expands. But even those who initially didn't intend to be in scope, so for example, a private ambulance provider who primarily does events and so on, but also starts to pick up work such as patient transport, they almost certainly will need to complete a toolkit submission as well. I appreciate that's quite a brief, but it's a fairly straightforward answer. And I will just say it is specific to England, not to Scotland or to Wales. Next slide, please. Now, I'm afraid there are 10 standards. I am going to try to run through these at a high level, and I'm going to try to avoid boring everyone to tears this afternoon. It is a heavy topic, so let's plow through. So the first standard is personal confidential data. So this standard is all about making sure that you're only using the right amount of data and only for lawful and appropriate purposes. Your staff understand how to strike the balance between sharing information and protecting it. So for example, they may need to share it with other people to protect a patient or someone else, or in order to prevent some untoward activity from happening. They have the expertise within the business to help them make those judgments. So for example, speaking to the Cold Cut Guardian to help them through that decision. Staff are trained in the relevant pieces of legislation that affect their work. So that's not just GDPR, that would be the Care Information Act and so on. And they are periodically reminded of the consequences to patients, service users, their employer, and themselves for mishandling personal and confidential data. For staff responsibilities, you must ensure that everyone understands what their obligations are under these data security standards, including their obligation to handle information responsibly and the personal accountability for deliberate or avoidable breaches, because yes, individuals are accountable. All staff that understands what constitutes deliberate or negligent or complacent behaviour and the implications for their employment. They're made aware of their usage of IT systems being logged and attributable to them personally. So quite a lot will put a message on screen on the computers when you log on, telling them that your activity on this computer is being monitored, and it does need to be reasonably monitored. Insecure behaviours can be reported without fear of recrimination, and procedures which prompt insecure workarounds are reported with action taken. Really important here that if you have a culture of fear and blame, people are not going to raise issues to enable them to be tackled in a timely fashion. You need an induction plan that covers training and sort of ensures that these things are sort of upheld. Next up, we have the training itself. So essentially, you need to make sure that everyone has an appropriate understanding of information governance and security. And there is flexibility here. There was less so a few years ago because there was some sort of standard mandatory training across the entirety of the sector. Now there is more flexibility within the organisation to determine what's appropriate. But everyone currently working for you, from a contractor to a director, must undertake a basic level of training, and everyone working with patient data in any way must complete appropriate training for that sensitivity. So that's officially, that's 95% of everyone, regardless of their employment status, in the last 12 months, or 100% of those who aren't on some kind of leave, such as maternity, paternity, long-term sick or something. And that's something where there's been a certain amount of, I'll say, creativity with the way people have answered the question, and so they've been very careful with how that's been worded in subsequent years. Next up, we have managing data access. This can be summed up as only accessible to those who need it for their role. So essentially, you shouldn't be able to see things you don't need, rather than relying on people having sort of restraint from going looking at things they shouldn't. But even if they have access, that access needs to be carefully logged and controlled, and risky patterns spotted and sort of handled appropriately. So for example, someone checking relatives' records or their own records and things like that. So principle here is what's called least privilege. Next up, we have process reviews, and this is something that does take quite a bit of work each year, I'm afraid. So this is going back through any instance, near misses, subject rights requests or complaints that sort of have sort of value to the process, and making sure that we're learning the lessons of what's happened. So if obviously DSARs or erasure requests have become complex and very difficult to deal with, then that probably indicates that the data itself should be streamlined or restructured. If there's been a lot of incidents around email, then obviously some actions around email handling in terms of warnings, prevention, using different technology to reduce the risks sort of warranted here. We have responding to incidents, which very closely connects with this in terms of the process, but here this is more about the sort of real-time component of it. So making sure that everyone is able to and does report internally to management any incident, near miss or risk, no later than 12 hours from detection, but essentially immediately, and that the organisation's able to report them externally either to the ICO within 72 hours or the DHSC within 24 hours, depending on severity and risk. And just say most organisations who use the toolkit should be using the toolkit to make those reports. It is a lot easier to do than using the ICO reporting form, I will say as well. So it's a handy tool for that. Next up, we have continuity planning. So what are you going to do if a system becomes unavailable? You're subject to ransomware, you have a power cut, or let's say a server room was over a combined heat and power plant and that took out the systems for a number of months. Unfortunately, a real example that happened to someone. How are you going to keep the services running in that situation? So are you reverting to paper and really understood robust processes for that? Do you have an entire backup solution that kicks in and we can sort of run from? Sort of how are we going to handle that? So having exercises where we drill and we test this and make sure that that's actually going to work, because it's great having the policy, but it needs to actually work in practice. Next up, we have unsupported systems, and this one it's a sensitive topic because it's caused huge issues in the past. The WannaCry incident around about 8 years ago was largely as effective as it was because of the prevalence of Windows XP. But at the same time, we do understand that equipment such as scanners and therapeutics, they have a shelf life that can be double the software life. So it's about having the strategies at the same time to enable that sort of shelf life to be maximized in a safe way. Ideally, though, still moving away from unsupported systems as soon as possible. Second to last, we have IT protection. So this is how we're going to respond to cyber threats or prevent them as well at the same time. So we're looking at network components, passwords, MFA, pen testing, perimeter security, single sign-on, all of those sorts of considerations around cyber. So there is quite a lot to that section. Finally, and this one doesn't apply to everyone, although accountability principle naturally does, but in terms of action, this one is a cohort of the standard respondents every year, plus the NHS trusts and so on that have to do this, in the sense that they have to get an independent assessment or audit of their toolkit submission that year. Next slide, please. So what do you need to do? So we've got a sort of process on screen here, sort of a logical order of tackling these things. So the first is to register for access. So obviously, if you've not done that and you need to do it, is get hold of NHS England. I appreciate they may have a lot going on at the moment, but that is the first step. So they'll give you what's called an ODN code, which allows you to get onto the toolkit. It's basically your organization code. Then we have completing the sort of the preamble, the company information. So who's got what role when it comes to data protection and security? So who's your DPO, CIRO, Caldecott Guardian, who is the accountable director, those sorts of things. If you've got any certifications in place or security standards or frameworks that you follow, declare these at this stage, because that makes a difference to the way the questions are answered later in the process. Update your information asset register and records of processing activities. Now this is fairly early because this affects how you're going to update things like your privacy notices or appropriate policy document later. So this is essentially an exercise whereby we go through all of the activities to do with data that you have. So where do you get information from? Where's it going? Where are you keeping it? How are you keeping it secure? Who has access? All of that needs to be documented and kept up to date every year. Next, we have refreshing the policy suite and uploading these to the toolkit. So these either need to be literally uploaded in the questionnaire, or a link to where they can be found, or a description of where they can be found on the network needs to be provided, because yes, they can ask to see them at any time. So in that review, we're looking at say privacy notices, internal document handling policies, continuity plans, things like that. Reviewing the logs of compliance, such as the incident register and DSAR responses, and providing an update on these. So what's your average response time for subject access or erasure requests? How many incidents have you had, of which how many were reportable? How did they happen? What are you doing to prevent them? Arrange penetration testing. So quite a large portion of respondents will be required to undertake penetration testing every year. Now, this can take either a complete approach where a pen test provider does everything, or you can do sort of hybrid models where, for example, two community interest companies will check each other, and then they will use pen testing to support that activity. Summarize the security practices. So this is back to those questions of multi-factor authentication, password standards, single sign-on, and the like. The continuity exercise and risk mitigation meetings. Now, these have to happen every year, and you literally have to get together. It could be online or it could be in person, and you even need signed attendance sheets for these, which they do ask either are uploaded or a location of where those sheets can be found. Digital is acceptable, of course. Those meetings sort of review how you're actually going to put these into practice, and actually just sort of running through what if scenarios. So if this happened, how is this going to work? But if this goes wrong, how does that work? Kind of scenarios. Training. This one is, I'll say most organizations struggle with training, get everyone on that one, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But yes, getting everyone trained, hitting that 95% number without any sort of interpretation or creative exclusion, that is a challenge for most every year. A report on the out of support systems and the mitigations for these, and this is something they do look into, because using this essentially as surveillance across the country to see, is this a trend that's improving or is it getting worse? Are there lessons that everyone can pick up from this? For some, as mentioned before, arrange an independent assessment of your toolkit submission. Now, this one's at the end because that's when the activity will happen, but we do recommend looking at that early in the process in terms of arranging it. Next slide, please. So we've covered most of this already. So again, I'm going to canter through this relatively quickly, if I may. Some providers, which ones each year may change, are required to get or rather get their questionnaire assessed independently by a third party prior to or immediately after submission. Once you're happy with the report and that you've completed all the tasks and there's sort of no inaccuracies, press submit. Immediately afterwards, you'll get one of two main ratings, which are standards not met or standards met. There is also approaching standards, but this is exclusively for social care providers who have a plan to achieve the standards and are not too far away from it, and standards exceeded, which is for those with Cyber Essentials Plus only. So you can only get that highest rating if you have CE Plus. ISO 27001 and CE Plus both reduce the need for input in the questionnaire. Essentially, they take the evidence that you've completed these as evidence that you're satisfying those requirements. So essentially, if you're doing one, it's sort of covering both. There is a baseline submission for some providers. Mostly these are NHS trusts and arm's length bodies. This is usually on around December each year. Essentially, it's just a way to see how is the sector doing prior to that sort of annual review. So that's why we see it's about 6 months early. Next slide, please. Challenges. I've touched on a few of these already. I think the first one, in all honesty, is getting everyone to complete the training and keeping on top of it. Everyone has a job to do that's not undertaking training. They've got a clinic to run, they've got a network to monitor, they've got an IT service desk to keep up and running. This is just something that's in the way of that, is how they see. It may be, but in order to do their job safely, they do need training. So it does need that priority. But it is always, I say, for the vast majority of people I've worked with, it's a slog when we're getting near to that deadline to get the last few over the line. Coordinating the key activities. So anytime you're trying to coordinate sort of 6 to 12 people to get into meetings at the same time and to review documentation and so on, diaries clash and things get moved and it gets pushed back a month. Oh, it's only going to be another month, and before we realize it, we're in May and it's due in July. due in June. So it's just being careful of that, really. Competing pressures, kind of touched on this already, but incidents happen, clinical requirements change, new legislation comes in as maybe happening later this year. Yeah, we get it. And unfortunately, it does cause delays for providers who have to complete the toolkit. So it is one of the pressures. The Information Asset Register and ROPA review. This is something that everyone should be reviewing every year, because otherwise it will get out of date very quickly, and it will lose its business value as well as its sort of standing for completing the toolkit. But it does require quite a bit of effort. Obviously, that can range from a few days from a smaller organization up to essentially a few weeks of a person's time to complete that work. So keeping on top of it, essentially all the time is an important step here. And procuring the independent assessment or the audit at the right time. So quite often people only discover that they need to do it when they're actually completing the toolkit, and it's right at the end. It's one of the last questions, and then they realize, oh, we need to get this, and the deadline's in a few weeks. So that's obviously a bit of a challenge when everyone else is looking for it at the same time. Next slide, please. So recommendations. So start early. It sounds obvious, but honestly, the earlier you start, the less the stress that this piles on. Maintain a year-round working group. So don't let this be something that only exists sort of from January to June, or sort of even March to June. Have the sort of working group living all of the time. Policy and record reviews throughout the year. These do not have to wait for when the standards are set around September. You can review these at any time, and I would encourage people to sort of have these scheduled month by month, so you're working on a different one each month rather than an all-in-one kind of process. Monitor training frequently. I would say at least monthly, have a report on the training compliance of personnel in the business. If you're really struggling with training, have a look at different ways of delivering that training. So instead of e-learning, is it better to have awareness sessions face-to-face, either online or in person, to get those last people over the line? Use the toolkit to demonstrate the good things you're doing rather than worrying being caught out for it. The stuff that's here is stuff you need anyway. There is pretty much, there is either very little or nothing in the toolkit that you shouldn't have to begin with, and this is just a way of proving that you're doing the right things. And identify your partners, such as penetration testing and audit providers at the start of the annual cycle rather than at the end. As again, sounds obvious, but it is a common thing for it to only really get the attention right at the end, and then there is a bit of a scrabble to find people. So over to James to talk about how we can help.
It's almost like you seamlessly planned that for me to do a sales pitch there, Richard. No, as Richard said, we cover everything toolkit, so we can help. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to procure Bulletproof or speak to Bulletproof. There's plenty of other providers out there that do this, and there's a lot of useful free material out there. So do check it out. We do everything toolkit. So whether it's Richard or another one of the GDPR team, we can be procured for some consulting work. So do feel free to reach out. What I'm going to do in the chat in a moment is put the contact at bulletproof.co.uk alias. Reach out to that with any of your requirements, whether it's toolkit, whether it's pen testing, ISO, cyber essentials. Reach out to us, and we've got a whole team of consultants at the other end of the phone. Whether it's free advice or we get you a proposal for any of these services, we're always there to help. So pen testing falls in line with everything toolkit. We do training in-house, whether that's GDPR, information security, cyber security. We have all sorts of training in-house. Cyber essentials, C+, ISO 27001. I see there's loads of questions about that in our chat, so we'll address that shortly. But we have anything compliance covered here at Bulletproof. DPO and VCSO services, if you need someone to run this or oversee it, we have all those services in-house on a fractional basis. And then anything we cover on the information security front, we always do a gap analysis. We don't want to come in and quote you for loads of consultancy that potentially you don't actually need. So why not start with a smaller engagement where we kind of lift the lid on your environment? I consider it almost lifting the bonnet of a car and see what's going on. For maybe 1 or 2 days consultancy, you could save yourself a big bill. And then we do internal audit services as if you were going to go externally audited, but we do that internal first. So that's Bulletproof, very much high level. Rich, is it worth me now asking a couple of questions that are in the chat that have come through, and some really good ones as well?
Absolutely.
I think we covered this a little bit, but more specifically looking at Cyber Essentials Basic, Margaret asks, we have Cyber Essentials Basic. How does this fit in?
Okay. In brief, most of the requirements of pretty much all of the requirements of Cyber Essentials Basic will be requirements of the toolkit. So it's getting you that sort of first step of it. It is also asked as sort of the minimum framework standard that organizations follow. You will be undertaking pretty much the same requirements as Cyber Essentials Plus as part of completing the toolkit anyway. So that's just the other way this sort of fits into that. Hopefully that answers that.
Yeah, I'm staying with Margaret now. Is penetration testing an absolute requirement for this? It's expensive. Margaret, number one, yes, penetration testing can be expensive, but there's also ways our consultants can make this tailored to your budget and make sure it fits inside the toolkit. But Richard?
So the requirement sits under Standard 6 of the National Data Guardian Standards. Which organizations have to get pen testing each year does change. So it'll be on your individual toolkit. It will say whether you need that or not. The specific considerations for it are all covered in Standard 6. There is really detailed guidance that goes with that, and actually we can talk through that sort of one-to-one with our team separately. But in terms of keeping it efficient, so obviously if you're a smaller organization or a community organization, sort of look at ways in which a partner organization, so for example, 2 community interest companies, they will check each other on some of the items, but then a professional pen test service will check other relevant items within that. So there are sort of hybrid models within that. There is also some scope for your internal IT to undertake some of the tests as well. So it's not that absolutely everything on the list needs to be outsourced to an external, but some parts really should be. But Standard 6 does give really detailed information on that. But no, not everyone will need to do it every year.
Thanks, Richard. Does one from Ian here, does this tie into DORA?
Yes, in that many of the requirements will align, is what I would say. So in terms of resilience, so resilience standards they may be phrased quite differently, but the requirements are essentially the same. We're sort of looking at sort of critical national infrastructure sort of considerations at the same time. So these spheres of national cyber resilience all pretty much align, including the toolkit ones. And the toolkit started to have more of an emphasis over the years on the resilience components of that. So that's why there's a lot of weight now placed on the continuity exercises, and sort of the prevention and what's going to happen if all your network is taken down. How are patient services, frontline services, or even the financial services of that going to keep running, including getting data to Public Health England and so on as well. So it's the answer is they align, but they don't replace each other.
I also know that DORA has a threat-led pen test involved in that, Ian. That's something we definitely do here at Bulletproof, but maybe requires a bit more of an in-depth conversation. So feel free to reach out. And for any of these questions, guys, I've put the contact in the chat. I think I've got one more in here. We currently have to ISO 27001. Thinking of doing this instead. Can you give some thoughts around this? Does ISO 27001, does that replace the toolkit, Richard, or is actually they're not mutually exclusive? They tie into each other.
So definitely one doesn't replace the other. ISO 27001 probably covers about 60-70% of the requirements of the toolkit. So if you're doing everything for for ISO, you're doing most but not all of what you need for the toolkit. If you've got a requirement to complete the toolkit, you have to do the toolkit, but that in itself isn't going to replace the benefits for insurance or for working with non-NHS organisations that ISO gives you. So they're complementary. Having successful ISO 27001 also reduces the burden of questions that you have to answer in the toolkit as well each year. So it just sort of streamlines it.
Thanks, Richard. I know there's a few more questions, but we're just conscious of time, so we're going to move on. And if there's time at the end for in the Q&A section, I'll ask the remaining questions. Thanks so much for everyone for putting them in so far. Next question, slide, please, Sam. Moving on to a case study, Richard. I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you very much. The customer that I have in mind at the moment was a technology provider to the NHS. They first identified that they had the need in 2022 when one of their customers asked them what their rating was, and they hadn't heard of the toolkit at that point. So they looked for help to start on the process in 2023. The first start of the process was discovery. So what do they actually have in place to begin with? So what training do they have? What policies, procedures? Did they have continuity exercises? Did they have an information asset register? Those sorts of pieces. Next, we have the working on the information asset register, and a terminology here. Information asset register is roughly equivalent to records of processing activities. They are slightly different things. They have a slightly different mindset. One can serve as the other with additional information being added in. So this was undertaken as a workshop-based exercise. So consultant-led, but with delegates from the business going through all of the activities. They're real examples there and then of how they receive, send, use, and sort of why they have data, legal basis, things like that, and obviously consultant support to get the legal information correct. That then informs the next stage, which is policies and procedures. So a full suite of policies was required, and there is one that quite a few well, actually there's two. It's starting to sound like Spanish Inquisition. There's another one and another one there, but there's two main ones that we find a lot are missing. So the first is the National Data Opt-out Policy. So you have to have a policy to comply with that. This is essentially a means by which people opt out nationally across England from their data being shared with other organisations for research purposes. There's a whole way of different, a whole range of different ways of complying with that, but you have to have a policy to comply with that, even if that policy is as simple as we're not going to do those activities and we're prohibiting that in the business. The other one is what's called an appropriate policy document. I won't give you the full title because it's very, very long and I didn't set it. That comes from the ICO. But it's essentially something very similar to a privacy notice, but it's specific to the sensitive data you hold for employment, social security, but also that affects criminal offences or background checks and things like that. But the other policies and procedures around sort of data handling, how to do a DPIA, subject rights request, sort of you name it. The next step was getting pen testing done. So in this particular case, it was a hybrid approach. So using external pen testing support and internal resource to do specific internal tests that were reasonable to do so, all fully audited and checked within that. And then finally, we had the submission. We'll just say within all of that, training sort of happened in the background, but there was a final wrap up at the end, essentially to capture any stragglers when it came to e-learning and so on. So we did an afternoon of training with those. Results. So year one, apologies, I think these are on the next slide. Thank you very much. In year one, achieved standards met. Year two, revised the exercise, and they completed Cyber Essentials Plus and ISO 27001 that year and subsequently achieved standards exceeded. In their third year, for the first time, they were required to get an independent assessment, which was successful, and there were no challenges to their assertions. So hopefully that gives a bit of an indication of what the journey can look like. And obviously there it's not a do this 1 year and that's it. It's sort of done. It's something you do have to keep up with, but it's something you can also improve on over time as well. Oh, next slide, please. So yes, please. Any questions you can throw at me, please do.
I've got a few more in here, Richard. And we're going to Gary. How do we confirm if we need a third-party assessment and if we need to do the cyber version of the toolkit?
So which toolkit you need to complete is based on your organization profile. So if you are so essentially you'll only need to do the CAF aligned one if you're an NHS trust, an arm's length body, a commissioning support unit, and the like. These are essentially for very large providers, not for sort of most of the independent sector or community sector. Or even for sort of GPs, dentists, and things like that as well. That they wouldn't be expected to complete that format. It's intended for those with bigger resources, essentially. The straightforward way of checking is seeing the list of providers, but the other is to actually check with NHS England when you're registering, because that will say what type of provider you are and make sure you're on the right toolkit.
Thanks, Richard. This one comes from Jacqueline Jacobs. If provision and management of IT and systems by a third party is, I imagine that's managed by a third party, go for it.
Apologies, James. There was a second half to the question,
go ahead.
which was if you needed an independent assessment. So on your questionnaire, towards the end of the questionnaire, there is a question which is, what is the assurance rating provided by your independent assessment? If that is listed as mandatory, then you need to procure that.
Great. Thanks, Richard. And going back to Jacqueline, if provision and management of the IT and systems is, I think, managed by a third party, which bits are they responsible for and which bits are we responsible for? Sorry, Jacqueline, if I've misread that, but I'm sort of filling in the gaps a little bit on that question.
I think that's an important question. And the incident with Advance recently in their sanction by the ICO is particularly relevant to that one, I would say. So the crux of it is you're responsible for your suppliers, but they are also responsible for themselves. So your responsibility within that is making sure that they're all appropriate, but you are still responsible for the safety and efficacy of things like your IT network and things like that. So you would need to work with your IT and managed systems provider to make sure that they've got everything correct. Also then that your sort of contracts and agreements have stiff penalties and things like that in there, that they're accountable if they deviate, and obviously that there is some kind of assessment to make sure that those things are true rather than taking on trust.
Thanks, Richard. Hopefully that answers your question, Jacqueline, but feel free to chime in again if it doesn't. C says, how does the toolkit help grow our business? I think that's probably something we get asked quite a lot in the sales team, actually, Richard. Can this be seen as a business enabler?
Yes, I mean, certainly in the sense that in order to work in the NHS in England, or for providers in the NHS in England, you will need to have this in place. And that could even be that you're providing services, or you want to provide services to, say, private dentists and things like that, because most of them will still receive NHS data and you will end up working with NHS data. In addition to that, it's forcing you to have everything in place so that when you're going through due diligence processes and compliance packs with those potential customers, that you have everything ready for those. So it actually makes it a lot easier because you essentially have that compliance pack with the answers and the evidence ready to provide them. And even outside the NHS, certainly within the public sector, but increasingly sort of in sort of charity sector and so on, we're seeing, standards exceeded, for example, as being, okay, you don't need to do these checks because we're taking that as the answer. So it can streamline that as well.
Thanks, Richard. I think that's all the questions we've got. Final slide, Sam. Thank you. Guys, please, I know you're on mute, but Richard, on behalf of everyone in the chat, thank you so much for taking this through us. It's a really broad, dense topic to get through. So we know every time this time of year, so many questions and hurdles come up. So thanks so much for taking the time to address this. Again, thank you all so much for coming. If this is your first webinar with Bulletproof, we do this. We try to do this at least quarterly, and we're also hosting an in-person event come May. So do watch out for any comms on that. Also, we will be sharing the slides. So I know we had a lot of process slides from Richard, so don't worry about jotting them down. We'll share the slides, and we'll also share the recording with everyone that signed up to this event. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Again, Richard, thank you so much. If you need Bulletproof, contact at bulletproof.co.uk. Feel free to quote the webinar, and there should be someone to help you. Take care, everyone. Thanks again.